Welcome to Next Round with me, Dale McDermott.
And me, David W. Higgins.
A young Irish look at the economy, politics and society.
Covering home and abroad.
For the thinkers, the dreamers and the doers, this is Next Round. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Next Round. Is it the end of peace in Europe? We want to talk about Trump's comments and policy with respect to a bit of a softening and a cooling of EU and US relations. And of course, all of this is also in the context of the recent federal elections in Germany, which has shown a rise in the far-right party, the AfD. So I want to analyse that, and of course all of this is in the context of Ukraine, and last evening there has been a deal agreed between Ukraine and the US on minerals, which we want to cover. We also want to talk then about wage data has been released recently as well for the last quarter, and also this in the context of pretty much industrial harmony in the country, and Ireland is very much at peace from an industrial relations perspective, but also want to analyse that data too. And finally, Trump going back to the never gift that keeps on giving, which is the replacement for a green card. And now there's a gold card where millionaire business people and entrepreneurs will be able to buy immigration status into the US. So I want to look at that as well. If you do like this podcast, please like, please share, and please subscribe. We're available on all major podcast platforms and also available on YouTube, where you can subscribe to our channel there and give our channel a like. David, good to see you this week.
Good to see you too, Dale. Plenty to talk about. Some of it's scary, but I'm sure we'll have some fair level-headed things to say about it.
Yeah, no, it really is indeed scary and fast moving as well. Again, I think the Trump administration celebrated might be a stretch, but definitely marked 30 days in office a couple of days ago. And one of the elements that we want to talk about today, of course, is this ever-growing gap between US and European relations. But in particular, of course, what this has from a security standpoint with NATO, and a security policy change which Europe is quickly coming to face. We have seen, of course, Trump has questioned NATO's value openly. He has been pushing allies to increase military spending yearly to 5% of GDP, which of course many countries are not meeting. We have seen this week UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer make the commitment for the UK to increase its defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, half of what Trump is pushing. And we've also seen Donald Trump take a pretty big step, his direct engagement and bilateral engagement with Russia in a bid to end the Ukraine war, which of course has excluded allies in Europe and even Ukraine itself from those at least initial conversations. And this piece, I think, David, ties to overall NATO deterrence and what this means for if the US would ultimately respond and support defending allies in Europe, should there ever be the unthinkable to happen, which would be, of course, an attack on a NATO or European member. And that is now very much in doubt.
Oh, it is. It is. And why has this changed? Like in the first Trump term, he was always talking about increasing the NATO spending, but there wasn't this sense of, okay, but the US still has our back, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now the mood has very much changed. Now the sense is, especially because of the outreach to Russia, the view now is, well, why would the US come to the defense, let's say, of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic countries, if Russia was to roll in the tanks in their next? Three very small countries. Yes, they spend a large amount of their spending on defense, but they'd be no might, even collectively, for the Russian army if they wanted to have a go. So this is a real pivotal turning point. And I think what we're witnessing on the deal, potential deal with Russia, is really sending Ukraine down the river. There's no other way to describe it. The minerals deal is a very kind of Trumpian thing of, look, how can this be good for the US, for its own coffers, for
the
its own,
art of the deal.
They are the deal. Yeah, yeah. And, early reports today, just talking on a Wednesday morning, might be that that deal could be already signed, could be announced soon, and that the talk is that there won't be much security guarantees as part of that. That's is that something that Zelensky is going to get popular support for in Ukraine? I don't know. The idea of not having security guarantees is that, well, because the US 10 years down the line will have companies across Ukraine mining these minerals, that the US will want to protect that. Therefore, it's an implicit security guarantee. If you have access to precious resources, then you're going to put boots on the ground to defend those. But the talk now in US circles is around how they can pull troops out of Europe. Talk that they might pull troops out of Greece or out of Poland. This leaves a vacuum. And when there is a vacuum, hostile powers will take advantage of it. And that's why you're right. You're now seeing talk of, okay, if the US doesn't have our back, our being Europe's back, then Britain, France, Germany, and others are going to have to come together and maybe put boots on the ground in Ukraine, in whatever settlement comes. If there's a peace deal, then you'll need peacekeepers and boots on the ground to kind of uphold whatever new front line is, a new border. That's that sort of thing. So we're in a really precarious and difficult situation, and it's a real step up moment though for Europe to actually look after its own security instead of being reliant on the US as it has been for quite a while now.
Yeah, so I think, and again, this deal is just starting to come out, and I believe the Ukrainian president, of course, I think is going to the Oval Office on Friday to sign this deal. But that key piece around security guarantees, the agreement does not explicitly state that there will be US security for Ukraine, is viewed as a point of concern for Ukrainian officials. Of course, I don't think it is a surprise given the recent rhetoric. Kiev's mayor, Klitschko, actually criticized the deal today as being unfair in the absence of security assurances as well. So, and I think then this points to, David, your point around, where to for Europe. And I know, conversations now are moving to, well, how does Europe need to step up in the absence of US leadership? I know, there's been talk of France and Germany considering a nuclear umbrella for Europe if that US deterrence weakens. And we've also seen then this whole conversation around EU defence spending. Nation states within Europe look at forming a European army. That, of course, would require treaty change. Ireland, of course, being a neutral country, might find that quite difficult politically to engage, but we really are facing, I think, a crystallizing moment for the EU and the direction that it takes or doesn't take.
Yeah, I mean, the bureaucracy that's there at the EU level is important. It's there to protect the likes of Ireland and our neutrality. But it means that if Britain, France, Germany, and Poland, some of the big powers want to come together and do something military that's outside the realm of NATO, but outside the realm of the EU, they really have to set up their own thing. And that'll have to be some sort of joint command, some sort of, hey, these are our protocols. If one of us is invaded, and if the US doesn't rush to our defense, here's how we engage. But then you end up somewhat duplicating the role of NATO as well, and that has its risks as well. I mean, would you be drawing in Canada and some other countries that are in NATO too into it? Even though they're not physically in Europe, you just have some technical things there. But I see a bit of hope in this, in that Europe has been a laggard on its military spending for some time. It's had military bases from the US, being boots on the ground from the US in Europe for some time. And that has been paid for by the US taxpayer. And there's no way of putting that it was a good deal for a good period of time. Now, Europe has to step up and spend its own money, get its own procedures in place. And I think long term that will be good for Europe. I think that will,
if we can agree it.
If they can agree, yeah. But I mean, it's, even the likes of Friedrich Merz now, who is the new assumed chancellor in Germany, largest party, all he has to do is get one more party, probably the SPD, in, and he will be chancellor, right? He used to be a big Atlanticist, right? That was where your military stuff has to be done, with the US, right? Because they're our security guarantor. But now he's saying we need to be independent. Massive change in his outlook to it. And the Germans are now talking about lifting the debt brake. A big rule that they've had in Germany for some time. And this idea of Schwarze Null, which means black zero, that you're always trying to balance the books, you're always trying to not run a deficit. Germans historically fearful of inflation and deficits being a route to that. That's why they have that policy. Now they're realizing, look, we cannot rearm in the way that we need to without spending money. So
Now,
they're gonna do it.
but of course, they are making this sudden shift on the backdrop of a seismic shift from an election perspective in Germany. And I know I just want to give some quick highlights on the German federal election, which of course happened on over the weekend. They were able to complete voting, of course, in 8 hours, which
Much
was
faster than us.
I was going to say a testament to efficiency of the Germans. And but just to give some quick highlights here. So the conservative CDU-CSU alliance, led by Merz, as you referenced, David, secured 28.5% of the vote. So they will become the largest bloc in the Bundestag. But I think the key point then is the AfD surge. So the far-right Alternative for Germany achieved its best ever result with 20.8% of the vote, moving into second place. SDP, of course, the ruling government, which is the centre-left party that experienced a huge loss, dropping down to about 16.4% of the vote. Which then turns to coalition prospects. And do you have this grand coalition, David? I think back to the grand coalition days of 2011 with Fine Gael and Labour, I beg your pardon, achieving a huge majority in the Dáil. But you're going to have key compromises over things like immigration, unemployment benefits, corporate tax, key issues that all in the face of trying to keep out the AfD. And of course then, if there's more turmoil in Europe, which there quite possibly could be, is this going to give space for parties like the AfD to continue to rise in the absence of actually being in government?
So it's important to remember that we've had grand coalitions in Germany before, and we have also had them with the AfD as the largest opposition party.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the first time that this has happened. That's not, and the AfD didn't spectacularly raise their support after the last setup like that, giving them the limelight of being largest opposition. Didn't send them straight into government next time. Doesn't mean that you can sit back and not worry about this. But there is a mood now, particularly, let's take the CDU. CDU is the party of Angela Merkel. Merkel was a big advocate of taking in Syrian refugees and others, arguments around needing to boost the population, make sure pensions aren't too expensive a couple of decades down the road. All those arguments have collapsed. Merz ran on a campaign of restricting immigration, not just in a bid to keep out the AfD, but because the party has genuinely owned up to a policy error that they have made. And that tells me that you're going to end up with a coalition which, with them as the key driver of it, is probably going to be more keen to thwart inward migration into Germany, which should, if you do it even reasonably successfully, moderate the rise in the AfD. That's not to say they're not a risk, for sure, that they very much are. If you're going to increase military spending, if you're going to raise your debt break and actually spend a bit of money, and then that may actually then be a boost to the German economy. And what does the German economy need right now? It needs a boost. We with falling employment in car factories, for example, major engine of the German economy. There's such a manufacturing base. But if you're going to replace that with factories that are going to be building tanks and missiles, that kind of stuff is good for employment. Mm-hmm. So, I don't see a bleak outlook here. The growth levels are low in Germany. Unemployment has been ticking up. There's real challenges. But when governments get going, and especially if it's around military spending, that is good for GDP. It's good for GDP.
Of course, tariffs from the US will be bad for GDP as well.
Yeah.
He is the great unknown, right? We don't know what'll happen there. So
yeah, but like Macron, I was really impressed with Macron this week. I watched his full 18-minute clip when he went on Fox News and spoke to the American people through Fox. Really a great way to speak to MAGA Republicans. And he was saying this great point he was saying that he had said to Trump, look, we want to invest in the US and we want the US to invest in Europe, and we can't, tariffs are a barrier to that. So, let's not, shut down both of our economies just for the sake of making the US relatively stronger than Europe. It was really compelling. And Macron seems to have a good ear, good access to the White House. I hope Merz can do the same. And if those kind of arguments get through, then the worst of the worst when it comes to tariffs may not emerge. I could be wrong. We could get absolutely walloped with them, and Europe could really, really suffer. But Europe is its own domestic economy. We sell lots of things to each other, and that market is still very much there, even if tariffs to the EU come in.
Yeah, it's well, look, I think, David, we live in hope, but I think the key point here is that piece around Europe being at this inflection point around, going it alone and growing up, I suppose, on our defense policy and having to think more as that independent bloc in terms of how we, to your point, David, keep our economies going ourselves. And I think seeing how that goes then from that key question around European defence, which is a divisive topic. And it'll be interesting to see how countries like Ireland navigate that. And you could also, of course, have a case of maybe even a two-speed Europe on this issue where, the major countries decide to just go ahead without the likes of Ireland and other countries who might be a bit softer on defence policy.
Yeah, for sure. For the point of view of neutrality, you're going to have the non-neutral countries kind of doing something separate. I mean, they already do by being involved in NATO.
They do. Yes, so that's right.
There is going to be something that leaves Ireland to the side, but that's fine because we're neutrals. We'll never be, boots on the ground in the same way, fighting right up against the Russian front line. I mean, that's just not our space. And that's something that...
I suppose, and it hasn't been our space, but I think, do we have to have that conversation as a country?
Yeah, it's happening. I mean, just on TV last night, there was some of the live TV shows are talking about increasing defense spending. Some people say you don't need to. I would say basic things that you do. You need to be able to police your skies. You need to be able to police your waters. You need to be able to guard the undersea cables. And that very basic level of defense we've been bad at. Mm-hmm. So there are reasons that we need to notch higher. The question then of how you link up with other European powers as they also begin to increase their spending, you got to tread carefully with that because you don't want to get pulled into a war that is an offensive war, not a defensive war. The idea of doing peacekeepers, for example, in Ukraine, if there's a peacekeeping mission, if it's an UN-led one, that's a good thing. Ireland should get involved in that. We have a good history of that. We bring something different to that, and go for that if the opportunity arises. And considering there's so many Ukrainians in Ireland, we've had a great kind of reciprocal relationship with the Ukrainians now. So I think that could be a very, very good thing if we did it.
Shifting gears to wage growth and industrial disputes in Ireland, David, I know we want to talk about the piece around wage growth, and Irish wages, of course, have been rising sharply over the years, and we're now entering a period of course, inflation cooling, finally, after many years, which means that real wages are growing. And this is all in the context of relative harmony from an industrial relations perspective, where we're in an economy with full employment, wage growth across all sectors, and very low industrial disputes.
Yeah, Dale. So these were 2-day sets came out on Tuesday, yesterday. One, the number of the level of wage growth. So the wage growth throughout 2024 to the end of the year was 5.6%. That's average weekly earnings. And that's a really healthy number. And I'll come back to that. There's loads of different ways I want to compare that and show why that's quite a solid number. But the other number then is industrial disputes. And there's many ways you can measure that. But one is just the number of disputes, which is where a company has a dispute with its employees. We've had years before, if you go back to the 80s, sometimes we'd have over 100 disputes launched in a year, which is 100 individual companies and many more workers involved in that. We get to the 90s, it drops to 30, kind of into the 30s. We were hitting, maybe 10, 12 in 12 in 2010, that sort of thing. But last year, Dale, there was only 5.
5. Wow.
It's 5. Yeah. And that's a really low number, right? Now, does that number tell you that all is well and workers are all happy and that kind of stuff? Look, it could just mean that disputes are not getting to the stage of a strike, right? We go back to the 80s, it was so much more common just to go on strike, as opposed to doing things like the Workplace Relations Commission, going to the Labour Court. We've mechanisms now to kind of resolve these things.
We have good mechanisms. We do.
Yeah, we do. But the reason,
yeah.
Go on.
Well, I think just the worry is so we have a situation where pay is rising, which is great. And unions seem to be negotiating, and the overall economy is going strong.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the question then is how is this tying to things like productivity growth? And I suppose the worry is that without a link to that, may we go back to the inflationary pressures that we had just a couple of years ago?
That the higher wage growth would then feed back into price growth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that, at least in the year gone by, we really haven't seen anything like that. So I mentioned 5.6% is the wage growth number. The growth in prices, CPI, was 1.4, was a fraction of it. Now, that doesn't mean that you'll then have a second round of it, i.e. you have higher wages, more demand in the economy, and then businesses all put up their prices. That's very possible. When businesses, thinking of small ones, restaurants, cafes, that kind of stuff, there's now higher minimum wage, there's pension auto-enrollment, a whole bunch of extra things that have come along on the cost side, with no real let-up in their input prices, the prices of food they have to buy and all that, energy costs and all are still quite elevated. There's probably going to be another pass-through of higher prices on that side, for example. So your 1.4 inflation, it ain't going back to zero, I think. But we are in a period, it's a period of real wage growth. So wages are growing faster than prices. Now, we did have a period during COVID and the cost of living stuff where prices were rising faster than wages.
Yeah.
So we've now flipped the equation back the other way. And we did so back in 23 as well. So it is a healthy sign. It means that government, for example, no longer needs to do things like the electricity credits. We can do away with those for next year, because wages are now covering people's ability to pay these things. The areas where other prices that are still quite high. So if you look at rents, for example, Daft have their Q4 number out. That was 5.7 growth year on year. 5.6 was the wage growth. It means that on average, and all these things are averages, doesn't cover every person's individual scenario, but if your wages are up 5 or 6 and then the rents that you're going to get to pay in the market up 5 or 6, you're actually unchanged broadly. Not to say things are great in the rental market, they're very much not, but certainly we didn't have 10 or 12 or 15% rent growth last year. We did, however, have higher house price growth. So the CSO reported that recently too. That's 8.7% growth in prices.
So the fundamental of a home, either purchasing or renting, is eroded entirely, basically from
Yeah. But I do think when people see things like 6% rent growth or 8 or 9% price growth, the first 5 or 6% of that is very hard to avoid when everybody has extra income, because anyone who goes out to go seek a property to rent it, everyone who's presenting has higher incomes. When people go to bid on property, like bidding on property is so dependent on your wages, because you get a multiple of 4 times if you're a first-time buyer. And then if everybody has higher wages, then the whole set of prices in the market tends to rise with that. Now, that's, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have the higher wages, very much should. But, the real, when people see those numbers of high rents, high prices, I always think to myself, right, well, what is wage growth doing? Because that can account for it. But then you need to look at the difference. You then need to say, okay, why are prices rising above that rate? Because what you want is prices to be rising less than how wages are growing.
And of course, there's also then, that's the average figure for wage growth. Different sectors, of course, have higher than that. I mean, the likes of, I think of, hospitality, arts and entertainment. They had nearly a 9% increase in recent years post COVID. Labor demand, of course, linked. Construction as well. Construction has had, due to labor shortages, of course, about an 8.5% increase. which has driven that pay up, of course, as well. And of course, then you have the likes of tech and ICT, which is again about 6.6%.
So those are the year-on-year numbers. There's a great chart that the CSO have put out, which is actually the 5-year change. So how much are wages up over the 5 years? So this is from the end of 19 Q4 to Q4 of last year, of 2024. If you're in that construction sector, over the 5 years, you're up 17.8%. If you're in something like healthcare, you're up 25%. All sectors are on average are actually up 25%. And then the top performers, one of which I wouldn't have guessed, arts and entertainment, is up 27, nearly 28%. Because that can often be a low wage sector, particularly people who are kind of, just gigging and that kind of stuff. It can be quite precarious. But our information and communications, basically IT, up 36% over 5 years. And you hear that said by auctioneers and people in the property sector. It's like, there's a lot of tech workers coming up and being able to buy property relatively easier than their peers in other sectors. And the wages are already quite high in that sector anyway. And they've actually grown a big step higher over 5 years.
Fascinating. So I think it's something we'll keep our eye on, David. I think as time goes on, but I think net good to see, and we'll see how that.
Just before we finish up this one, what's the outlook for wages? And this is where I just want to bring in a bit of work the ECB do on wages. They have an indicator of negotiated wages. So this is where they gather all the wage agreements that are happening across Europe, because unions tend to go out and bargain for their wages, and a deal might be done that sets wages for the next 2 years or something like that. The ECB wage tracker, it's been elevated in recent years. It's been as high as maybe 5%. It's now at around 4.1. So it's still quite elevated. But what the ECB also do is they do a wage tracker, right? So they try and take a bunch of other variables and they try and look out a year from now and see where wages will go. And where their tracker was kind of at the 5 and 4 and has kind of tracked this move going up, they have it coming right back down to 2 a year from now. And that is a sign that because interest rates have gone up, because big powerhouses in Europe like Germany, as we mentioned, have been slowing, and a tick up in unemployment there, that you may well have a real halt on this wage growth in the coming year. So whilst the picture has been quite good up until now, we could really see a pause. And particularly if you're in firms where there's this uncertainty now around tariffs and all of that, bargaining for wage growth is going to be harder this year. The levels that come through this year will probably be less than we had last year.
Okay. Well, I think, again, one to keep an eye on. And another element I want to talk about, David, is I think it's an interesting change in immigration policy, which is that President Trump has announced the Trump Gold Card, which is a new...
This is for the high wage people, Dale, the people who are on the crazy big money. Yeah.
Which is basically for foreign investors who are willing to pay $5 million. And this is basically designed to replace the existing EB-5 immigrant investor program, which required a lower investment and also had specific job creation mandates. So the key new program is that applicants must contribute about $5 million directly to the US government. This card then grants permanent residency, green card privileges, which of course also provides that route to US citizenship. And really it's aimed to attract rich individuals to spend, invest, and create jobs, boosting the US economy. So, I mean, it's an interesting proposal. I think it would require congressional approval. I don't think this is exactly something which you can do by executive order, although I might be wrong on that. But I suppose there are other countries in the world, David, that have, this sort of investment threshold to get access to living and residency rights. Malta comes to mind, for example. Although a good bit less, I think it's about $870,000 dollars of investment. Turkey, the Caribbean islands as well do it. Jersey, of course, as well. They have what's called a high value residency program, which is really tailored to attract high net individuals to come and live there. And I think they have to have basically an annual income of over £1.25 million, and also have to, I think, then purchase a property on the island. So interesting proposal, and we'll be curious to see the reaction.
Yeah, I have a very immature first reaction, which is that you could never call the scheme a gold card in Ireland because of the Coppers gold card.
Indeed, yes, of course.
Yeah, yeah. That would just get way too confusing
Uh,
for for some people. But no, the schemes like this. So like this has come up on my screen for over a couple of years. Yeah, you mentioned some of the European countries, Portugal, Spain, Greece, Malta have all done it, and they've all tried to get investment in. And these were countries that were quite impoverished after the '08 crash and had big deficits and in a way needed the money. But what some of these countries have found is that like you have risks of money laundering, that your schemes are just being used by wealthy individuals to hide their revenue essentially and move
mhm.
dirty money into another country. And whilst you have some stipulation around, okay, you need to invest it locally, if you're investing in things like property, well, are you just pushing up property prices? That's been a big complaint of the Portuguese and Spanish schemes. These countries have had big jumps in their property prices in recent times.
This was kind of
Like prices.
the nomad visas, right? Where you had digital nomads who'd come over and almost work there, generally in high-paid tech jobs that don't require a physical presence where they are. And they were going into, let's say, Portugal, for example, and driving up all of the localized rent prices. And they've now banned that visa or significantly changed it.
Yeah, now there's almost two types of person there. If you're just an ordinary tech worker going in and just bringing your laptop and working away, you might be taking up an Airbnb, and that is a demand that could otherwise be used for a local. That sort of housing problem. These schemes are for the high wealthy
Yes,
individuals where
totally.
where you have to bring investment with you.
Yeah.
That's the bigger question: is should you allow those kinds of schemes? I mean, the big risk now with Trump in office. I mean, he was asked this, I think, yesterday about whether would a Russian oligarch be able to apply for this scheme, and because Trump is now effectively, at least in his utterances, giving the Russians what they want when it comes to the Ukraine deal, why would he not also lift the sanctions and the restrictions that have been placed on individuals, and then also give them the option of investing into the US? And that could be with a headline of, oh, well, these guys have to bring investment and jobs. And then if they're just putting their money into US bank accounts or into property, that does nothing for the local US economy. It doesn't have much of a multiplier on jobs, because if you have to have some of these schemes, you have to create 10 jobs. If you just create 10 Mickey Mouse jobs and they're actually just people managing your money or something like that, like it is not a real economy boost in the way that other investment is.
There'll be a surge in high net worth and single family offices in the US, I think, as a result of this.
Yeah.
It'll be the fastest growing industry to get into.
Yeah, and then Russian will be the most highly spoken language on Duolingo in some of the US cities. Now, look, that's more exaggeration. The numbers involved in these things are often quite small, right? So you some of these schemes only have a dozen or a couple of hundred people that apply to them, because the number of high net worth individuals in any country at any given time is not so large. So this is really a counter to this idea of that these things push up property prices. That there doesn't tend to be enough of these people in these schemes for that alone to be a thing. The thing we mentioned about tech workers, Airbnbs, that kind of stuff is more impactful on local property and rental prices. The real risk with this is that it's a small scheme, but it's abusive and unfair. It's letting criminals off the hook, and then you have a real injustice problem that arises out of it. That's the bigger thing. These things, as far as I've never seen these programs significantly, move GDP in a way that changes the country around for taking it from poor to rich. I haven't seen that sort of outcome in any of these schemes.
Yeah. But I think, though, it does cover more about that equity piece around. I mean, previously, to immigrate to the US, it was very hard, and you generally had to do it either through business sponsoring you or talent. Those were them, or of course marrying someone in the US. Those were the ways to do it. But now you have a situation where you actually have the option to buy entry. And I mean, given the demand to enter the US from a lot of countries, if you have $1 million, and again, it's earned not through the best means, that is probably a wider challenge that the US, I mean, the US has struggled, of course, with immigration reform for decades now. Maybe this might spur that conversation within Congress to actually once and for all come to a solution that is equitable, fair, linked to their key initiatives to grow the economy, and actually have a, similar to Australia or Canada, that points-based immigration system that is tied to economic demand and priorities for the country, as opposed to now where you have, either directly linked by business applications through H-1B, as I mentioned, marriage, or the lottery, which is still, of course, in place.
Yeah, if that goes to Congress, then what's the reaction going to be? Oh, okay, yeah, high wealthy immigration is good because we get investment from it. And then we've already had this awakening now in the US on the right, driven by Vivek and Musk, where they supported the H-1B visa, which is kind of your computer programmers and high-skilled people coming in. They are very much in favor of that too. So as you begin to go down the stack of immigration, they're like, okay, I actually do want that type. I actually do want that type as well. And then you get down to the lower skill, lower wage stuff. And that's where MAGA tends to have a problem. And they want the border with Mexico to be sealed right up, and other routes of immigration to be really cut off. But what does MAGA also want? They want record levels of an investment in blue collar in the US. They want big factory construction for pharmaceuticals, for EVs, for a whole range of sectors. They want to build a load of homes. Yeah, you can't do that with immigrants either. That's going to be the big constraint that MAGA faces. And this is where I think there's actually some big reprieve on Ireland. If Trump wants to build a load more pharmaceutical plants in the US, well, where's he going to get the workers? Okay, maybe he's only going to build one or two at a time. Okay, well, that means then Ireland doesn't need to have our pharma plants uprooted. There'll still be a use for those for many years as we continue to supply the global demand that's out there. Maybe that's too optimistic, but I do think that is a major constraint on the US economy right now. They have quite a hot labor market, have had for some time. It's cooling too, same as Germany's is and others. So maybe the world will come when they'll be able to cut off those immigration flows. But then if you have unemployment, that's a worse economy as well.
Yeah. On that note, we are out of time. So we want to thank you all again for listening and watching. If you did like this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe to it. We are available on all major podcasting platforms, also available on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe to our channel. That's all we have time for this week. David, good to see you again, and we will talk to you soon.
See ya.